On a July afternoon in 1979, sweltering and thick with the particular heat that settles over Brooklyn in midsummer, three men wearing ski masks walked into a restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick and proceeded through the dining room to the patio in the back. The men at the lunch table heard them coming. Two of the men at the table had been told they were coming. The other three were about to understand something that Carmine Galante, who had spent nearly 70 years in this world, and who had been hearing warnings for the better part of 5 years, apparently had not fully believed. The photograph taken afterward is one of the most recognizable images in the history of American organized crime. The man in it is sprawled in the rubble of what had been a pleasant afternoon meal, shot through with shotgun and handgun fire, and in his mouth, as it had been for essentially every waking hour of his adult life, is a cigar. The cigar was not an affectation, it was almost a philosophy. It communicated something about the man that no amount of explaining could have conveyed as efficiently, that he did not care what you thought, that he was not performing for your benefit, that he had decided long ago what he was and was not going to apologize for it. The cigar in death was the cigar in life, unchanged. He was 69 years old. He had walked out of federal prison 5 years and roughly 5 months earlier, and had, within weeks of his release, done something that no one else in his world had: the specific combination of violence and contempt and organizational ambition to attempt. He had simply declared himself in charge, not of one family, of all of them. The people who controlled those families had something to say about that. It took them 5 years to say it clearly, and when they did, three masked men delivered the response on a Brooklyn patio on a day that was far too hot to be wearing a leather jacket, which is what two of the men at the table were wearing, and which told the story of exactly how that afternoon was going to end. The story of what Carmine Galante was and how he came to be on that patio is one of the most instructive chronicles of ambition outrunning judgment in the entire history of American organized crime. Drop a comment below letting us know where you are watching from. It genuinely is one of the best parts of doing this. And if you are new here and want more history, like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Bushwick and the man who had been told his whole life that no one would dare. East Harlem in the years just after the First World War was not a neighborhood that suggested many directions for the children growing up in it. It was a world of tenements and street corners, of immigrant families navigating a city that had no particular reason to make things easy for them, and of an organizational presence that had been embedded in the neighborhood long before most of its residents arrived. The Italian-American community of East Harlem was not simply a geographic community. It was a social structure, with its own hierarchies and its own unwritten obligations, and for a boy born into a working-class Sicilian immigrant family with no particular resources and no particular prospects, the direction that structure pointed was not obscure. Camillo Carmine Galante was born on February 21st, 1910, in a tenement building in the East Harlem section of Manhattan. His father, Vincenzo, had been a fisherman in the village of Castellammare del Golfo on the northwestern coast of Sicily before emigrating to New York City in 1906. His mother was Vincenza Russo, also from Castellammare. They had arrived in America 4 years before their son was born, and they were raising their children in a city that was still, in many essential ways, foreign to them. Castellammare del Golfo is a small fishing village on a bay, and it had produced, in the years around the turn of the 20th century, a remarkable concentration of men who would eventually reshape organized crime in the United States. Among them was a young man named Joseph Bonanno, who had also been born in that village and who would arrive in New York and eventually build a criminal organization that bore his name. The shared village of origin between the Galante family and the Bonannos was not coincidence in the way that most coincidences are. It was the first link in a chain that would define the next 50 years of Carmine Galante's life, every alliance he formed, every loyalty he commanded, and eventually every miscalculation he made. The criminal culture of East Harlem in the 1910s and 1920s was already well organized before Galante was old enough to understand it. Vito Genovese had been building his presence in the neighborhood. The families that would come to dominate the city's underworld were already in formation. For a boy who showed criminal tendencies early enough to be sent to reform school at the age of 10, and who dropped out of school entirely in 7th grade at the age of 15, this environment was not simply a backdrop, it was an education system of its own. During his early years, Galante worked at a series of jobs that investigators would later characterize as covers for his actual activities: a fish sorter, an employee at an artificial flower shop, a hand at a trucking company. These were the visible surfaces of a life that was organized around something else entirely. He had formed a juvenile street gang on the Lower East Side before he was a teenager. By the time he was in his mid-teens, he had already come to the attention of the criminal world in a way that made the official working life records almost beside the point. The village his parents had left behind, Castellammare del Golfo, would define the alliances and the loyalties and eventually the fatal decisions of the next 50 years of his life. December the 12th, 1925, was the first date in what would become an extraordinarily long official record. That afternoon, the 15-year-old Galante appeared before a court and pleaded guilty to assault charges. He was sentenced on December 22nd, 1926, to 2.5 years in state prison. His parents, by most accounts, had largely given up on him by this point. A boy who was in state prison before the age of 17 was not a boy who was going to be brought back by ordinary means. The years between his release and his next serious encounter with the law were years of positioning. He was working his way into the world that had always been the obvious destination for someone with his specific combination of physical intimidation, indifference to consequences, and organizational intelligence. The arrest record was accumulating, receiving stolen goods, association with known criminals, the kinds of charges that accumulate around the edges of a criminal career in its early formation. Then the 1930s arrived and the record became considerably more serious. In August of 1930, Galante was arrested in connection with the murder of police officer Walter de Castilla, who had been killed during a payroll robbery. The case against him collapsed. No witness was willing to speak. The pattern that would run through the rest of his life, the legal system reaching for him and finding nothing it could hold on to, was already in place. That same year, law enforcement caught Galante and other members of his gang attempting to hijack a truck in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. A gun battle followed. NYPD officer Joseph Minahan was wounded. A 6-year-old bystander standing nearby was also hit. Both survived. Galante did not. On February 8, 1931, Galante pleaded guilty to attempted robbery and was sentenced to 12.5 years in state prison. During his incarceration, prison doctors sat down with him and produced a formal assessment. Their diagnosis: psychopathic personality. The finding was not particularly surprising to anyone who had observed how Galante operated. What the diagnosis established officially was what the record already showed in practice. This was not a man who experienced the normal range of hesitation, remorse, or social inhibition that prevented most people from doing the specific kinds of things Galante had already done, and that would keep them from doing the things he was still going to do. He was released on parole on May 1st, 1939. By 1940, he was carrying out enforcement work for Vito Genovese, confirmed by FBI files compiled during the period, and it was in the service of Genovese, in the winter of 1943, that Carmine Galante would commit the act that transformed him from an accomplished criminal enforcer into something that commanded a different level of organizational attention. By the early 1940s, Vito Genovese had been living in fascist Italy since 1937, having fled the United States to escape a murder charge, and had made himself useful to Benito Mussolini in ways that crossed the line between organized crime and political violence. The relationship required demonstrations. The specific demonstration required in the winter of 1943 was the silencing of a man named Carlo Tresca. Tresca was an Italian-born American anarchist who had been living and writing in New York since 1904. He was the editor of a newspaper called Il Martello, which means the hammer, an Italian-language anarchist publication that had been a fixture of New York's radical immigrant community for decades. In the years leading up to the American entry into the Second World War, Tresca had turned his considerable editorial energy against Mussolini and against the prominent Italian Americans who had supported the fascist regime before switching their position after Pearl Harbor made that support untenable. His editorials had made enemies, and among the enemies they had made was Genovese, who had his own reasons to want the criticism stopped. Genovese allegedly gave the contract to Galante. The order moved through the organizational connections that tied Genovese's world to the Bonanno organization which Galante now operated, and by the evening of January 11th, 1943, everything was in place. Tresca had just left his office in Manhattan that night at approximately 9:30. As he crossed Fifth Avenue and 15th Street, a black Ford pulled up alongside him. A short, stocky figure in a brown coat stepped out of the car, placed a pistol against Tresca's head, and fired a single shot. The figure returned to the car, which accelerated away. The car was found later, abandoned, with all four doors standing open, a detail that spoke to the speed and finality of the departure. Galante was arrested as the prime suspect. The witnesses who had been present, including Tresca's companion Giuseppe Calabi, could not make a definitive identification. No one was ever charged. The case file transferred to the New York County District Attorney's archives decades later without a resolution, and it remains there. After the Tresca murder, Galante was returned to prison for violating the conditions of his parole. He was released on December 21st, 1944, and he walked back into a city and an organizational world that understood, in the way such worlds understand things, exactly what he had done and what it meant. He left prison in December of 1944 with a reputation that had been made in the dark on a frozen Manhattan sidewalk, and that no one with any knowledge of the organizational landscape would ever again question. Joseph Bonanno had built something that no other New York family boss had thought to build in quite the same way. An organization with international reach, with operations in Canada and Cuba, and with ambitions in Sicily itself, run by a man who had understood before most of his contemporaries that the future of serious criminal profit was not in the street-level operations of an earlier era, but in the industrialized movement of substances that entire governments were attempting to suppress. Bonanno was from Castellammare del Golfo. His family and Galante's family had come from the same village. In the world of the American Mafia, where trust was the scarcest resource and the organizational bonds formed earliest were the ones that lasted longest, this shared origin was not a minor biographical detail. It was structural. It was the foundation on which every subsequent arrangement between the two men was built. By the time Galante returned from his second prison term in 1944, the Bonanno family had noted what he had done in the service of Genovese, and Bonanno had drawn his own conclusions about what kind of man could be trusted with the most serious work. Galante became Bonanno's driver, and then his soldier, and then his captain, and eventually his underboss, rising through the ranks at a pace that reflected both the trust Bonanno placed in him and the genuine organizational capability Galante brought to every assignment. He was not the kind of figure who appeared frequently in the social pages or the police department photographs. His name meant nothing to the general public. His face was not one that journalists recognized outside the narrow context of his periodic court appearances. He was, in the organizational sense, exactly what Bonanno needed: an effective and ruthless operational instrument who generated results without generating attention, and who brought to the international dimensions of Bonanno's ambitions a combination of language skills, physical willingness, and strategic intelligence that made him uniquely suited for what Bonanno had in mind. Galante spoke various Italian dialects, Spanish and French. In a world of American organized crime that was largely confined to its own neighborhoods and its own language, these were extraordinary assets. They were the keys to the specific operation that Bonanno had been building towards since the late 1940s. And in 1953, Bonanno decided the time had come to expand the organization's northern operation, and there was only one man he trusted to do it. Montreal in 1953 was not a city that most American organized crime figures had any particular reason to think about, but it sat at the intersection of two logistical realities that made it, for a man building an international heroin pipeline, perhaps the most important transit point on the North American continent. The city was a French-speaking metropolis with established connections to the heroin refineries of Marseille. Its border crossings with the United States were numerous and incompletely monitored, and it had an Italian-Canadian criminal infrastructure organized around a man named Vincenzo Cotroni of the Cotroni crime family that Galante immediately set about incorporating into the Bonanno operation. Galante arrived in Montreal in 1953 and, by all accounts, transformed the criminal landscape of the city in a matter of months. He aligned the Italian-Canadian networks under his control, established the import protocols, and built a distribution chain that would move heroin from French laboratories through Canadian ports into the northeastern United States. Police estimated that Galante was collecting gambling profits in Montreal of approximately $50 million per year during this period, in addition to the narcotics revenues. He was not a gentle administrator. Investigators came to believe that Galante ordered the murders of drug couriers who delivered too slowly or whose handling of shipments was insufficiently careful. The bodies attracted attention from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which had not previously had occasion to observe the Bonanno family's operations at such close range. By April of 1956, the Canadian government had seen enough. Galante was deported back to the United States. The Canadian government had removed him from the country, but it had not stopped what he was building, and within a year he was at a hotel in Palermo, discussing with Lucky Luciano how to make what he had built in Montreal into something far more permanent and far more dangerous. October of 1957 brought together at the Grand Hotel de Palme in Palermo one of the most consequential gatherings in the history of organized crime's international drug trade. Joseph Bonanno attended. Galante, now serving as the family's consigliere, attended with him. Frank Garofalo and Giovanni Bonventre were also present from the American side. Representatives from Detroit, Buffalo, and Montreal joined them. The Sicilian Mafia sent its own representatives, including the significant figure of Giuseppe Gencorusso, and Lucky Luciano was there, his presence confirmed not by the men who attended the meeting, but by the Italian law enforcement agents who were tailing him and followed him directly into the hotel when he arrived. The specific agenda of the meeting has never been fully documented. Bonanno later maintained publicly that it was a social gathering among old acquaintances. The organizational logic of traveling thousands of miles from New York to Palermo, gathering the most significant figures in the American and Sicilian criminal worlds, and staying for several days suggested a purpose more specific than nostalgia. What the record establishes is that after the meeting, the heroin pipeline between Sicily, France, Canada, and the United States was dramatically reorganized and expanded, and that Galante returned to New York with a delegation of young Sicilian men who would serve as both enforcers and liaison to the supply side of the new arrangement. These men would eventually be called the Zips. Galante also attended the Appalachian meeting in upstate New York the following month, the November gathering of American organized crime figures that was famously discovered by state police. He evaded capture by concealing himself somewhere on the estate of the meeting's host, and he left Appalachian that day without appearing in any of the arrest records. The federal government had been watching the narcotics operations for years. In 1958, Galante was indicted on narcotics conspiracy charges. The specific allegation was a conspiracy to smuggle 160 kilograms of heroin from Cuba, Mexico, and Puerto Rico. The first trial ended in a mistrial in May of 1961 after the foreman of the jury broke his back in what was described as a fall inside an abandoned building. Federal prosecutor William Tendy stated publicly that there was no question the foreman had been pushed. Galante was sentenced to 20 days in prison for contempt of court and no more than that. The second trial reached a different conclusion. On July 10, 1962, Carmine Galante was convicted on federal narcotics charges and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison with a fine of $20,000. He was 52 years old, and everyone who knew anything about the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg understood that a 20-year sentence for a man his age was very close to a permanent removal. The federal penitentiary at Lewisburg was not a place that produced diminished men, and in Carmine Galante's case it produced something closer to the opposite. 12 years of enforced patience, during which the organization he had helped build was falling apart without him, and the plan he had spent those years assembling was growing more specific with every month he remained confined. While Galante served his sentence, the Bonanno family went through a period of turmoil that came close to destroying it. Joe Bonanno had attempted to expand his authority in ways that alarmed the other family heads, and a period of internal conflict known as the Banana War produced enough damage that the commission forced Bonanno to retire in 1968. The family that bore his name passed through a succession of short-lived arrangements. Paul Sciacca, then Frank Mari, who was murdered. A period of group leadership followed, with Philip Rastelli, Natale Evola, and Joseph Di Filippi sharing authority. Evola died. Rastelli outlasted and outmaneuvered the others. During the same period, prison psychiatrists who examined Galante produced their own formal assessment. The diagnosis was psychopathic personality disorder. The finding was consistent with the assessment made 30 years earlier during his first major imprisonment. The distance between 1931 and the early 1960s had changed many things about Galante's circumstances, but apparently nothing about what the institutional instruments of psychological evaluation found when they looked at him carefully. He was paroled from Lewisburg on January 24th, 1974, after serving approximately 12 years of his 20-year sentence. His first documented act as a free man was an act of contempt toward a dead enemy. Frank Costello, the former boss of what had become the Genovese family, had died of natural causes in 1973. Galante reportedly believed that Costello had helped engineer the narcotics prosecution that had sent him to prison. Within days of his release, Galante arranged for Costello's mausoleum at St. Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens, to be dynamited. The police report stated that the doors of the tomb had been blown off and the remains had been disturbed. The message was conveyed. Whether Costello would have been capable of receiving it was beside the point. The commission was also in motion. On February 23, 1974, at a meeting at the Americana Hotel in Manhattan, the commission formally named Philip Rastelli as boss of the Bonanno family. The appointment was straightforward as commission appointments went. It did not anticipate Carmine Galante. Rastelli was, by multiple assessments from the period, a mediocre administrator who was viewed as a good boss by exactly no one. He did not have Galante's organizational intelligence, his physical presence, or his demonstrated willingness to do whatever was necessary. What he had was the commission's formal endorsement. What Galante had was the understanding that formal endorsements meant less than practical authority, and the conviction that he was going to demonstrate the difference. Galante bullied Rastelli into deferring to him. The specific mechanisms of that process are not fully documented in the public record, but the outcome is not disputed. By the spring of 1974, Galante was operating as the effective power within the Bonanno family, commission appointment notwithstanding. Then Rastelli's own legal troubles removed him from the equation entirely. Rastelli was indicted in March of 1975 for operating an extortion and protection racket involving mobile lunch wagons on the streets of New York. He was convicted after a 2-week trial in April of 1976. He was already serving time on a separate gambling case from Long Island. Between his state and federal cases, Rastelli would remain incarcerated for years. By 1976, Philip Rastelli was in federal custody on an extortion conviction, and Carmine Galante had stopped pretending to answer to anyone. What Galante built between 1976 and 1978 was not simply a criminal organization. It was an architecture of personal loyalty, designed to function independently of the commission structure that governed every other organized crime family in New York, and that independence was both its greatest strength and the precise attribute that was going to get him killed. The foundation of the architecture was the Zips. The young Sicilian immigrants E. Galante had been importing and positioning since the late 1950s. By the late 1970s, these men, drawn primarily from the Castellammare del Golfo region of Sicily, and loyal to Galante personally, rather than to any American organizational structure, were operating along Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick, Brooklyn, out of pizza parlors and pastry shops that functioned simultaneously as legitimate businesses and distribution infrastructure. They were the pipeline, both the physical couriers who moved the product and the international connection to the Sicilian supply networks that Galante had spent 2 decades building. His personal bodyguards were two of these men, Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato. Bonventre was a remarkable figure even within this remarkable cohort. He was young, extravagantly handsome, and wore his shirt open with a gold crucifix at his chest. He was, somewhat improbably, a cousin of Joseph Bonanno himself, which gave him a status within the organizational world that went beyond his formal position. Amato was Bonventre's own cousin. The two men were inseparable from Galante during this period, present at every significant meeting and every operational moment. They were the visible embodiment of the Zip strategy, men whose loyalty everyone assumed was absolute. Galante revived the Montreal heroin pipeline that had been his great operational achievement of the 1950s and expanded it. He positioned himself as the central node through which the heroin trade of the northeastern United States moved. He organized the murders of at least 8 members of the Gambino crime family, moving directly against Paul Castellano's organization in a dispute over control of drug trafficking operations that the Gambinos had been running in territory Galante considered his own. He moved into Manhattan Garment District operations and demanded tribute from businesses that had previously answered to other families. He took over gambling and loan operations running out of Penn Station. He was operating out of a venue called the Magic Lantern. The Drug Enforcement Administration had identified him publicly as organized crime's top man, and somewhere in this period, he did something that violated the most fundamental principle of the organizational world he had spent 60 years inhabiting. He declared himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, the title that Salvatore Maranzano had claimed in 1931 and had held for approximately 6 months before Lucky Luciano had him killed. The title that the commission structure had been specifically designed to prevent any one man from ever claiming again. Galante claimed it. He reportedly told associates, who later described the conversations to investigators, that no one would ever kill him. They would not dare. The commission existed, in theory, to prevent exactly what Carmine Galante was doing. It had been created in the aftermath of the Castellammare War precisely to distribute authority across families in a way that would prevent any one figure from accumulating the kind of concentrated power that produced violent responses. The commission had already removed Joe Bonanno from his position for attempting something considerably less aggressive than what Galante was now doing openly, but removing Galante was a more complicated proposition than removing Bonanno had been, because Galante had built a private enforcement army that answered only to him, was generating profits that made the cost of confrontation difficult to calculate, and had made it known in the clearest possible terms that he regarded the commission's authority as at best advisory. Frank Thierry, the boss of the Genovese family, was the man who began to build the consensus for what had to be done. He moved carefully through the network of family heads, making the case that Galante's monopolization of heroin profits, his war against the Gambinos, his murders of men from other families without commission approval, and his explicit claim to authority over all 5 families constituted a threat that could not be managed through the normal channels of organizational diplomacy. The conversation found a receptive audience. Even Joseph Bonanno, retired to Arizona, who had spent decades building Galante from a driver and enforcer into an underboss, who had trusted him with the most sensitive international operations the family had ever undertaken, gave his approval for the killing of his former protege. Philip Rastelli, still the official boss of the Bonanno family, formally sought commission approval to have Galante eliminated. His request was relayed by his trusted ally Joseph Massino. The approval was granted. The logistics fell to two of Rastelli's most capable capos, Alphonse Indelicato, known throughout the organization as Sonny Red, and Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black. They worked the problem from multiple angles. The most consequential angle was the one no one outside a very small circle knew about. Bonventre and Amato, Galante's zip bodyguards, the men whose proximity to him gave any potential attack its only realistic path, were offered a deal, promotion within the family structure and a meaningfully larger share of the narcotics operation that Galante had been running largely for his own account. If they got on board with what was being planned, they would benefit from it. The two men who wore their crucifixes to Galante's organizational meetings agreed without visible hesitation. They were not going to die on a patio in Bushwick defending a man who had kept most of the money for himself and had made enemies of every powerful figure in New York organized crime. Galante, who had reportedly told anyone who would listen that no one would dare move against him, apparently did not register what the men closest to him already knew. Someone picked up a telephone and called Joe and Mary's restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue and asked whether his uncle was eating lunch there that day. John Turano was 25 years old, the son of the man who owned the restaurant, and he answered the telephone that morning and confirmed to the caller that yes, his uncle was there. The caller identified himself as Jimmy Galante, the Don's nephew and driver. He was calling, he said, to check on his uncle. John Turano told him what he needed to know and hung up. The restaurant at 205 Knickerbocker Avenue was owned by Giuseppe Turano, a soldier in the Bonanno family and a cousin of Galante's, and on this particular afternoon Turano had set up a lunch on the open patio at the back of the building. It was July 12th, 1979. The heat of the day was settled and absolute. The five men at the lunch were Galante himself, Leonard Coppola, a loyal Bonanno capo who had been a committed Galante supporter through the years of the power struggle, Giuseppe Turano, the restaurant owner, and the two bodyguards, Bonventre and Amato. Something about the day was slightly wrong if you were paying close enough attention. It was a hot summer afternoon, and both Bonventre and Amato had arrived wearing leather jackets. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, three masked men entered the restaurant from the street and moved through the dining room toward the patio in the back. John Turano heard one of them say, "In the back, Sally." He ran to a storeroom and pulled the door closed behind him. The three men stepped onto the patio and opened fire with shotguns and handguns. Galante, Turano, and Coppola were killed instantly. Bonventre and Amato, whose leather jackets had been worn for exactly the reason you would wear a leather jacket on a hot day when you expected a shooting, were not hit. They emerged from the aftermath without a scratch. Carmine Galante was 69 years old. He had a cigar in his mouth when they shot him, and he had a cigar in his mouth when the photographers arrived, and that detail, the cigar unchanged from the meal to the aftermath, was what every newspaper in the country led with the following morning. The gunman who fired the shots that killed Galante was Anthony Indelicato, known as Bruno, the son of Alphonse, Sonny Red Indelicato, who had coordinated the operation. FBI surveillance captured Gambino underboss Agnello Della Croce congratulating the younger Indelicato approximately 30 minutes after the shooting, and that surveillance tape, combined with a palm print found on the door handle of the getaway vehicle, would eventually put Anthony Indelicato in federal prison. In November of 1987, he was sentenced to 40 years. He served 11 years and was released in 1998. The photograph taken on that patio ran on the front page of newspapers across the country the following morning, and for many people who encountered it for the first time, it was the first time they had ever seen the name Carmine Galante attached to any story at all. What the murder of Carmine Galante set in motion within the Bonanno family was not the orderly transfer of power that Rastelli and Massino had anticipated. It was the opposite. The three capos who had participated most directly in the killing, Alphonse Indelicato, Philip Giacconi, and Dominic Trinchera, emerged from the event expecting the rewards that had been implicitly promised. What they found instead was that Rastelli's faction, now organized around Joseph Massino, had a different assessment of their future within the organization. The three capos represented a power base that Massino could not comfortably share, and within 2 years of Galante's death, the internal war within the Bonanno family had reached its own conclusion. On May 5th, 1981, Massino arranged for the three capos to be invited to a social club in Brooklyn under the pretense of a peace meeting. Four masked gunmen, including Salvatore Vitale and the Canadian mobster Vito Rizzuto, emerged from a storage closet when the three men arrived and killed all of them in the storeroom. The bodies of Giacone and Trinchera were taken to a location in Queens and buried there. Alphonse Indelicato's body was found in a vacant lot. The three capos' murder, as it became known, ended the internal war. It also ended something else. From September of 1976 through July of 1981, an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone had been living inside the Bonanno family under the assumed identity of a jewel thief named Donnie Brasco. He had worked his way from the fringes of the organization into a position of sufficient trust that he was on the edge of being formally inducted as a made member. The three capos' murder created a wave of internal violence and investigation within the Bonanno family that forced his handlers to pull him out. He left in July of 1981, taking with him 5 years of intelligence that would produce the conviction of more than 120 Bonanno family members. The zip strategy that Galante had built his final years of power on did not survive long after him. Cesare Bonventre, the bodyguard who had agreed to stand aside and who had been rewarded with promotion to the rank of captain at the age of 28, the youngest capo in Bonanno family history, became deeply involved in the heroin trafficking operation that Galante's network had made possible. This operation, which used Italian pizza parlors as distribution points and became known as the Pizza Connection, was dismantled by federal authorities in the mid-1980s. The trial that followed, concluded in 1987, was at the time the longest federal criminal trial in American history. Bonventre himself did not live to see his conclusion. He was killed in 1984, his body found dissolved in barrels of industrial glue. Philip Rastelli, who had ostensibly orchestrated Galante's removal in order to resume his proper position as boss, was convicted again in 1985 on federal racketeering charges and served the remainder of his life in and out of custody. The family he had technically led since 1974 was expelled from the commission during the years of its internal turmoil and remained on the outside until Joseph Massino rebuilt its operations in the 1990s. There is a specific kind of ambition that organizes the entire world around a single imperative without attending carefully enough to the consequences of success. Carmine Galante had spent 50 years building toward the moment when he could declare himself the boss of all bosses, and when he reached that moment, he found that the organizational world he inhabited had no mechanism for absorbing such a declaration from someone it had not sanctioned to make it. The commission had been specifically constructed by men who understood organizational dynamics as well as Galante did to prevent exactly that concentration of authority. The last time someone had tried it, the attempt had lasted approximately 6 months. He lasted 5 years, which was longer. It was not long enough. The specific quality that made him valuable to every organization he had served throughout his career, the absolute refusal to be deterred by what other people thought was possible or advisable, was the same quality that destroyed him. The man who had carried out a political assassination in wartime Manhattan because someone needed it done, who had built a heroin pipeline from Sicily through France and Canada into the northeastern United States because someone needed it built, who had walked out of a federal prison at the age of 63 and immediately set about taking over a criminal organization that had already given authority to someone else, was incapable of moderating the ambition that had powered all of those achievements to the point where it might not kill him. What the commission answered with, 5 years after Galante walked out of Louisburg and named himself king, was the most permanent available response: 3 men in ski masks on a hot afternoon, a cigar that burned down to the end, Carmine Galante is buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens. The network of drug trafficking relationships he built between the Bonanno family and the Sicilian Mafia outlasted him by more than a decade, running through the Pizza Connection operation and into organizations that federal prosecutors were still pursuing in the late 1980s. His shadow fell across the Bonanno family long after his body was gone from it. The photograph from the patio at Joe and Mary's remains the way most people encounter his story for the first time: a dead man in a garden chair, 69 years old, with a cigar still in his mouth. It is a photograph that communicates something specific about the man and something specific about the world he had inhabited. The cigar was there at the beginning, and it was there at the end, unchanged, which was exactly the way he had lived, and which is perhaps as close as the historical record comes to explaining both what he achieved and what it cost him. He had told people, more than once, that they would not dare. The cigar was still in his mouth.